The Scarlet and Violet era of the Pokemon TCG is finally upon us, and along with it today my full set review on this new batch of cards. Now, I don't think Scarlet and Violet is looking to radically shake up the power level of the game, which honestly isn't really uncommon for a base set of a new block of cards, but rather serves as a solid foundation to introduce us to new mechanics, or in the case of Scarlet and Violet, a return of an old fan favorite. So say goodbye to Pokemon V, and hello once again to Pokemon EX, but more specifically the Pokemon EX mechanic from the mid-2000s, not these abominations from the early 2010s. While Pokemon EX do share the same multi-prize mechanic as Pokemon V, the big and honestly best difference is that these cards evolve properly from normal single prize Pokemon once again. Now, if you're just as stoked as I am about this mechanic coming back, and are thinking about picking up some Scarlet and Violet cards for yourself, just a heads up, friends of the channel over at flipsidegaming.com are still taking pre-orders on sealed product. You can use coupon code RARECANDY for 10% off, and you'll get free shipping too. Or if Flipside is out of stock by the time you see this video, you can also use my affiliate link with TCGPlayer. They'll find you the next cheapest listing online, and it does really help support the channel too. I'll be sure to drop links to both of these down below in the description. But as for today's set review, guys, as always, I've got you covered. I've got timestamps pinned to the top of the comment section. That way you can jump to any cards you might want to hear about in today's review. But with that being said, remember to smack that like button, feed that always hungry YouTube algorithm. Let's jump in and check out what Scarlet and Violet has in store for us. So we're just going to jump straight into these new Pokemon EX with the brand new Spidops EX. And the big selling point to this card is this ability. It says your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost is 1 colorless more. And then its attack for a grass and colorless does 90 plus 30 more for each energy in your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost. So I think the combo here is pretty obvious. We want to get ideally 4 Spidops EX in play. That way we can get that 120 damage buff. So if we assume on average our opponent has a 2 retreat cost, if we have 4 Spidops EX in play, we'll be hitting for 270 damage, and that's excluding if we have something like a Choice Belt or a Defiant Band to increase our damage output a little bit more. So on paper that doesn't sound that bad, because you can technically push to one-hit KO Pokemon V-Star and a lot of these new Stage 1 Pokemon EX, but you're sort of banking on a lot of things going your way to make this happen. Of course, like I said, we're just assuming they have a 2 retreat cost and not a 1 or a 0. And we're also assuming that we can get all 4 Spidops EX into play without our opponent knocking out any or not prizing any. And if I'm being honest, I think it's kind of unlikely to assume that that's going to happen for you most games, especially because you ideally want 4 Spidops in play. That doesn't leave you much bench space for other like consistency boosting Pokemon. In fact, I think if you actually do want to build around Spidops, I think you might even need to include the Zoroark from Evolving Skies, because one of the upsides to Pokemon EX is that they are technically Stage 1s, not V-Stars, which means Zoroark can transform into them. And that actually does help get around one of the issues that Spidops has, where if your opponent knocks one out, normally you wouldn't be able to get another one set up in a single turn, but thanks to Zoroark, you can immediately transform back into the one that just left play to make sure that damage output is kept at a maximum. So that is nice. We have a work around that, but we just have no bench space for consistency boosting Pokemon like Barrel, like the new Revavroom, etc. But you don't technically have to build around Spidops as an attacker. There definitely is the option to just play this as a bench sitter for Leafeon VMAX. Since Galar is leaving the format, this can now act as your way of increasing your opponent's retreat cost. But needless to say, I think having to play multiple Stage 1 EXs is a bit clunkier than just being able to slap down a stadium and get the same effect. And speaking of Galar, I actually do think if we still had mine in the format, I think Spidops actually would make a better case for itself, because then it would actually be able to hit for the numbers that it needs to take those big one-hit KOs. And guys, if we're not taking one-hit KOs with Spidops, there's just easier ways at playing the 2-hit KO game with Pokemon that are more consistent, have more manageable attack cost, and have more HP at that too. Next up, we have Arboliva, a new Stage 2 Pokemon that has an ability. It says whenever you play this Pokemon from hand, to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you may heal all damage from one of your Pokemon. And then a little bit less interestingly, does have an attack for 2 grass and a colorless does 150. But of course, the ability is definitely the star of the show here. And actually, we have seen some effects like this in the past of the Pokemon TCG see a little bit of success. There was a Primal Groudon deck many years ago at this point that played a Dragonite that did the same thing. But I guess we have to think about what decks might even want this sort of healing effect, and also what decks can fit this in. That's another question as well. For me, I'm thinking about all of the tankier Pokemon that we have in the format. As you can see on screen, I have a couple of those pictured, with basic decks like Blissey V probably having the most free deck space to be able to commit to this. But we also will have some of these tanky dragon Pokemon still in the format, like Hisui and Gudra and Duraludon VMAX. But ultimately, my reservation for this card is that it's a stage 2 Pokemon, guys. It's very difficult to get in play, and with us losing strong search cards like Inteleon, I'm actually skeptical if most decks have an engine that could easily find this when they want it. So I think there is some hope for this card, again, just from the precedent that Primal Groudon and Dragonite has set before it. But right now, especially when it has to compete with other healing cards like Cheryl and another new healing Pokemon we're going to look at later in this set review, I think it's going to be pretty difficult to say this card's going to find success. Up next, we have Arcanine EX, which is also going to be our first Terrestrial Pokemon of the set review. So of course, all of these Terrestrial Pokemon, they have this effect on them where they can't take bench damage. But looking at the attacks on Arcanine EX here, for 2 fire energy does 30, plus 10 more for each damage counter on this Pokemon. And its second attack for 3 fire energy does 250, and you discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. So while it's slightly different, this is actually extremely similar to the Reshiram and Charizard GX that we had at the end of the Sun and Moon era, which actually I would say is one of the best fire-type Pokemon we've had of all time. So you might be a little bit confused by my rating on screen, but one of the big differences between Reshizard and Arcanine is that this card doesn't really have the same energy acceleration and engine that fire Pokemon had back at the end of the Sun and Moon era. Yes, we do have cards like Magma Basin, which no doubt you would absolutely play in this hypothetical Arcanine EX deck, but once you start using Pokemon that have more than just a 2 energy attack cost, Magma Basin just feels very weak as a form of energy acceleration, because if your only powered up Arcanine goes down and you need to set up a new one, you will need the help of some other method of cheating energy into play with something like Raihan if you do want to get Bright Flame powered up in a single turn. And generally, I think the damage this hits for is pretty good. Bright Flame is only a choice belt away from knocking out Pokemon V-Star. There's cards like Moltres you can use to put on early pressure. There's even the Rapidash from Silver Tempest that can increase your damage output. So it's not that fire doesn't have a good bit of support. I just don't think it has good support for Pokemon with more than a 2 energy attack cost. So for that reason, I am going to have to pass on Arcanine, at least for the moment. Next up, we have another new fire Pokemon that is going to be Armarouge. It's a stage 1 Pokemon, has actually a pretty familiar ability we've seen in the past. As often as you like during your turn, you may move a fire energy attached to one of your bench Pokemon to your active Pokemon. And then its attack probably will never be used, but for 2 fire and a colorless does 90, and your opponent's active Pokemon is now burned. So for me, the Pokemon that instantly comes to mind is going to be the Quagsire back from the Sun and Moon era that did basically the same thing, but with water energy. And Quagsire actually was a playable card. Never was tier 1, I would say, but definitely found some success. So thinking about the uses for this card, I actually think there's more to it than you might initially think. Obviously, the big easy combo you can make with this is that you can use Magma Basin to get an energy into play and move it to your active fire attacker, since Magma Basin is limited to just accelerating energy to benched Pokemon. But I guess you could also make the argument you could just play more switching cards in your deck, and that would accomplish the same thing. And most of the time, I actually would totally agree with that. But on the plus side, you do also get to avoid the damage counters that you would take with Magma Basin, which isn't always going to be an issue. But sometimes that 20 damage can make a difference in terms of you being able to take a hit. But I think those are some of the least interesting uses for this card. For me, there's 2 that really pique my interest a little bit more. The first is that this does not specify basic fire energy. So while right now we don't really have anything like Aurora Energy or Rainbow Energy in the format, if we do get special energies like those yet again, which it's inevitable, let's be honest, you actually would be able to move those energies with this ability as well. And as a result, could have Armarouge at the center of some sort of multi-type toolbox deck that can shift energies amongst its different attackers. So that's definitely thinking a little bit longer term for this card, but in the short term, there is another use for this that I do want to point out, and that is that this could be a workaround for decks that previously played Double Turbo and Twin Energy, think like the Zoroark's Toolbox deck. But now, since we are losing Twin Energy, all of these styles of decks need another way at being able to get their Pokemon powered up. So with Magma Basin, you can actually just accelerate your energy to Armarouge, use its ability to move the fire energy to your active Pokemon you want to attack with, and then just attach one single energy from hand for turn. And this gives you a workaround, albeit a slightly clunky one, to being able to attack with these multi-colorless energy-based attackers. So I'm actually going to say right when this card releases, I do not think it's going to be good. This is going to be straight up binder fodder, but we've seen abilities like this find success in the past. And there's actually a lot more you can do with this card than the very basic energy switch style effect for fire Pokemon. And for that reason, I'm going to land a little bit more in the middle on this one. I think this card definitely has promise, but it just isn't there quite yet. Up next, we have Slowbro, another Stage 1 Pokemon with a cool ability, and this one says, as often as you like during your turn, you may move a damage counter from one of your Pokemon to this Pokemon, and then has kind of a throwaway attack for a Water and Colorless to 60, and you heal 30 from this Pokemon. So if this ability sounds familiar to you, it probably should. This is kind of similar to the Gengar we had back from Sword and Shield, but this is actually the exact ability we had on Dusknoir back from Flashfire. But the big upside to Slowbro, of course, is that this is a Stage 1 Pokemon, making this so much easier to get into play. And being Slowbro specifically also does come with a little bit of a bonus perk. Since you're already playing Slowpoke, you might even be able to include the other Slowbro from Pokemon Go as maybe some sort of late game finisher. But definitely the star of the show is this ability, and I think really could allow for some creative healing plays here. So in the case of Dusknoir, we saw players use it to move damage counters to their Dusknoir and then use Max Potion to heal off Dusknoir, leaving their attacker in the active spot with all of their energy still intact. And I definitely think you could replicate that same sort of strategy with the current card pool today. I think the idea here is you want a couple of these Slowbro into play, because really with only one in play, you're limited to just healing 90 per turn. We can move all of our damage counters off of our active Pokemon to these Slowbros, and then just Cheryl them away. And this actually does get around the limitation of Cheryl only being limited to evolution Pokemon. So some of the tankier basics out there like Blissey V now actually have a way to abuse Cheryl, whereas they previously never been able to. And of course, the other downside to Cheryl is that you normally would have to discard your energy, but you also could use Slowbro alongside different evolution-based Pokemon as well that might not have a way at being able to replenish their energy and play immediately after it gets discarded. Now, of course, if there is a downside to Slowbro, it's that if you're playing maybe a 3-3 line in your deck as an example, well, guess what? That's probably space you normally would have wanted for something like a Babero or a Revavroom line or some sort of consistency boosting Pokemon, and Slowbro definitely does eat into that sort of deck space, I would imagine. But I can't help but think the pros are going to outweigh the cons to this card, and I'm really excited to see how, if at all, this card is going to see play. Next up, we have Gyarados EX, which is also our only other Terrestrial Pokemon in this set. And it has two attacks. The first one for 3 water energy just does a vanilla flat 100. And its second attack for 3 water and then 2 more colorless does 180 plus 180 more if your opponent's active has any damage counters on it. A lot of shock value built into this attack. 360 is an insane number. I mean, you're really one-shotting anything that you go up against, especially since they already are going to have at least 1 damage counter on them as well. But of course, the other shock value that's built into this card is this attack cost, and that's really the Achilles heel to Gyarados, I think. It's just going to be very difficult to set up both this energy cost and also the damage counters needed for this 180 increase. Now, of course, we are getting Hawlucha to replace Galarian Zigzagoon, but the big downside to Hawlucha is that it can't target the active Pokemon. And without cards like Scoop Up Net to be able to reuse this card, it might be difficult to always guarantee that the Pokemon you're attacking into is the one that has damage counters on it. And again, speaking of cards that have rotated, we are losing Frostmoth in the rotation, which probably would have been one of the big considerations for this Gyarados. And with Melanie not working on Pokemon EX, we're really only left with Frostlass, which, like Melanie, only accelerates a single energy at a time. Or we have to look to Origin Form Palkia V-Star, which is far and away our best option because technically you can accelerate 3 energy with Origin Palkia, then slap down a double turbo energy for turn. But I would just argue that you could build a better, different Palkia deck that doesn't have Gyarados in it. And even though 300 HP on a stage 1 is honestly insane, that is really good. That's more HP than most of the V-Stars running around. Lightning Weakness definitely could come back to bite this card as well, since Lightning is seeing a good bit of hype going into the Scarlet and Violet set. So again, Gyarados, it hits like an absolute truck, but I think some things definitely would need to change in order for this card to see some play. Next up, we have the only Scarlet and Violet starter that's going to appear in the set review. That's going to be Quaquaval. Now, its attack is nothing special, just a water and 2 colors for 140, but its ability says once during your turn, you may attach a basic energy from hand to one of your Pokemon. So honestly, not a bad ability, but like in the case of some of the other Pokemon you'll see throughout the set review, The big issue is that it's a stage 2 Pokemon. So had this been just a stage 1, I actually might take this card a little bit more seriously because it doesn't specify water energy. It's any type of basic energy, which is great because of course energy acceleration is a bit of a revolving door, so to speak. There's almost always one or two types within the game that don't have energy acceleration, and having a nice generic form of acceleration for any type is good. You know, if we are dead set on playing this though, Dragon Pokemon seem like a good contender, but I would argue, guys, that most of the dragons have different forms of energy acceleration they can use, and also we still have the Lost engine with Mirage Gate if we do want the option to accelerate any sort of energy that we want. So again, guys, this is not a bad ability, but it's just on the wrong stage Pokemon, unfortunately. Next up, we have a card that I don't think is very good, but it's too goofy not to at least highlight here. That's going to be the new Wugtrio. It's going to be a stage 1 Pokemon with 90 HP. I do want to throw out there that's actually really good because, of course, we can search this thing out with Level Ball in addition to its pre-evolution. Always nice when we can do that. But the reason this card has seen some attention is for this second attack. For 3 colorless energy, you flip 3 coins. For each heads, discard the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck. So yes, if we flip 3 coins, that's going to be a 9-card discard. That's pretty good. Like, that's actually really good. Compare that to Durant for a second, which only mills up to 4. But of course, guys, we have to flip all 3 heads, and we are losing Glimwood Tangle in the rotation, which means we actually really don't have a great way at ensuring that this attack will work when we want it to. But I think even just flipping 2 heads is good enough if we can get this card to work. That's still 50% better than what Durant does on most turns. But even outside of this coin flipping effect, you guys can probably start to see some of the issues this card has. First of all, it's a stage 1 rather than a basic like Durant. So just inherently, this thing is going to take up more deck space. And also, I think the other big issue has to be the attack cost. Something like Durant can be powered up with just a single double turbo energy, but Wugtrio, on the other hand, actually is going to need some additional acceleration to help it out. There's a variety of stage 1 Pokemon that could help with cards like Cherim, Flaffy, or Frostlass maybe. So even though there are workarounds to all these different issues I just highlighted, you have to devote so much deck space just to getting the core of your Wugtrio deck functioning. You probably don't have the deck space to double down on this whole milling disruption strategy. So I'm going to pass on Wugtrio, but I imagine this will be at least a fun meme deck that people will play with online. Next up, we have 2 Pokemon we kind of need to talk about together. That's going to be Dondozo and Tatsugiri. So the Tatsugiri, just at a glance, doesn't look too crazy. It does have an attack that allows you to search your deck for 2 basic water energy and attach them to one of your basic Pokemon, and also has an attack that can do 30 and you put the card back into your hand. So nothing special there. But in the case of Dondozo, for 2 colorless energy, it has an attack that does 50 for each of these Tatsugiri that is in your discard pile. Okay, so now we're cooking. We have a 160 HP basic that can attack for just a single double turbo energy and do 180 at its max damage output. Gotta say, doesn't sound too bad. We're going to be 2-shotting pretty much anything that gets in our path. And I could even see this having maybe a decent Lost Box matchup, since you're a 1-prizer that they're probably going to have to 2-shot, but you're going to be taking 1-hit KOs on them. So that's already, I think, pretty promising. You can probably survive the 1-prize Gatekeeper deck in the format, and then you just sort of go toe-to-toe with the other multi-prizers in the format. But I do still have some reservations about this card right now. Of course, like I mentioned earlier in the set review, we did lose Twin Energy, which means we do have to find some other form of energy acceleration for our deck. Because of course, the 4 double turbos is not going to cut it unless we were trying to use something like Silene to recycle them. I think we can probably use water energy since it naturally pairs well with Tatsugiri, and Frostlass might be able to pick up the slack for the turns where we do need that extra energy. But I think another option that's worth considering also could be the Armarouge that we just looked at. While that would sort of take attacking with Tatsugiri off the table, the one big upside I could see to Armarouge and Magma Basin being that we can actually include Radiant Charizard as another potential late game attacker. Because the big issue with Dondozo that I see is that, again, you're never really taking one-shots, and there are going to be games where you do need that big one-shot out of nowhere. And Charizard plus maybe a Choice Belt can provide that utility in those sort of situations. So that's something I wouldn't mind experimenting with as well. But again, these are much clunkier strategies than just being able to play another 4 Twin Energy in your deck. And of course, the other issue is just quickly getting Tatsugiris into the discard pile. I don't want to undersell how badly losing Quick Ball is for this potential archetype. Since Nest Ball can't put Pokemon into hand, and of course doesn't discard anything like Quick Ball does, because the big issue is we need to get 4 Tatsugiri into discard to ensure that we can reliably two-shot stuff. So I actually think the Dondozo deck will be a decent functioning deck, but right now I'm just a little bit concerned if it's going to be at the same power level as some of the other top tier decks that are going to exist in the format. So finally getting into some of our lightning Pokemon, which definitely are some of the more hype from the set, we have Magnezone EX. 330 HP, 5 in weakness, 3 retreat cost, and has 2 attacks. The first one for a lightning energy, does 50 for each energy attached to all of your opponent's Pokemon, and the second attack for 2 lightning does 220, and you do 30 to yourself. 330 HP on a 2-prize Pokemon admittedly is pretty solid, especially when we compare this to Pokemon VMAX that have a relatively similar amount of HP but give up an additional prize. Though to be fair, if we do use this second attack, that might put a dent in a Magnezone and maybe put it into one-shot range of your opponent. But if we can keep Magnezone alive due to its somewhat low attack cost, I feel like one route we could go with this card is playing things like Cheryl. Since you can use your first couple turns to build up to a Pulse Launcher attack, then after you get attacked into, you can Cheryl all the damage off, then reattach one lightning and follow that up with Energy Crush. But even still, both these attacks, I think, definitely have a couple issues with them. Obviously, like I already mentioned, Pulse Launcher does damage our Magnezone, which is something we definitely don't really want. And its first attack, while it does have high potential, especially against decks that flood energy into play like Arceus variants, at the end of the day, this is something your opponent can play around, and there's a lot of decks that don't put a ton of energy into play at a time. I think a lot of the time, this attack is probably only going to be capping out around maybe 100, 150 damage or something like that. So we have a Pokemon here whose attacks really aren't better than the Miraidon EX we're going to look at shortly, but it's on a stage 2 Pokemon, and being at stage 2 also means it is a little bit more difficult to make use of something like the new Electricity Generator. So if you do need help cheating some energy onto your Magnezones, you'll have to use Electricity Generator on your Magnemites before you evolve, which might be kind of awkward. Alternatively, you might have to look to something like Flaffy, but that's another evolution line you might not have the space for since we're theoretically a stage 2 deck, and that really might only leave your best option for cheating extra energies in play being stuff like EXP Share, or probably more likely Raihan. So there's a lot of cards that do pair with Magnezone, but they're all kind of awkward in some way or another. I don't think this card's completely awful though. The attacks are serviceable. There are, like I said, a lot of cards that can pair well with it. It's not affected by cards like Path to the Peak or Temple of Sinnoh. There's potential maybe for some healing strategies, but this card's going to have to compete with not only Miraidon EX, but also Ampharos EX, which is another stage 2 lightning Pokemon that also is trying to make a case for itself. So while I do think there's a little bit of hope for Magnezone EX, it's certainly not one of the top cards we're getting in this set. Next up, we have a new Pachirisu. Pachirisu, just a little basic lightning Pokemon, 70 HP. So of course, not only can we get this out with Stormy Mountains, but this is going to be lovable, searchable, which is great. One retreat on this card, also something I definitely like since Beach Court is probably one of the top stadium considerations for lightning decks after Scarlet and Violet. But Pachirisu, it has an ability that says this Pokemon can't be paralyzed. So they may as well have not even printed this ability. This is not very relevant whatsoever. I don't think we really have any popular abilities that are inflicting status conditions. And the few somewhat relevant attackers that can paralyze Pokemon, like the Articuno that saw some success during the Silver Tempest format, do so much damage that they can just knock out Pachirisu to begin with. So again, really weird ability they chose to put on this thing, but hey, I guess technically it's better than nothing. But the attack here, definitely a little bit more promising for a Lightning and Colorist, is 10 plus 20 more for each of your benched Lightning Pokemon. But this attack's damage is not affected by weakness, which might end up being sort of the fatal blow for this card if it doesn't wind up seeing play. Because otherwise, I think the idea here is you can power this thing up with one manual attachment and then either one Dynamotor or one energy from Electricity Generator. And with a full bench doing 110 and a choice belt, you can one-shot things like Palkia V-Star and Lugia V-Star. But unfortunately, now that's no longer really an option, but I still think there are some plays that Pachirisu does sort of enable. So a card like Miraidon EX, while pretty solid, it's not a great attacker against some of the low HP Pokemon running around in decks like Lost Box. So Pachirisu here has a lower attack cost, it only gives up one prize, and could be a more efficient way at dealing with sort of like small, low HP Pokemon, and also does give you a 1 prize Pokemon to maybe force your opponent into a 7 prize game at some point. That being said, Pachirisu does have quite a few other lightning Pokemon it has to compete with for space and decks, so I'm not really sure if this card's going to be good enough to make the cut in every lightning deck out there, but honestly, I think we probably will see this card pop up from time to time. Next up, we have a spiritual successor of sorts here. We have Rotom with the Junk Hunt attack that says search your discard pile for an item card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So of course, guys, this is sort of the spiritual successor to the old Sableye back from Dark Explorers, but There are some pros and cons, and unfortunately, I do think the cons here sort of outweigh the positives. I think the big positive to this card is that this attack is just for a single colorless energy. That definitely makes this card a lot more splashable than Sableye was, since Sableye did require dark energy specifically. So while yes, we can get back a lot of these very powerful item cards like Crushing Hammer, Cross Switcher, etc., the big downside is that this only gets a single item card compared to the two that we got with Sableye. And even though it's just one card difference, it is going to be enough, I think, to probably keep this card from seeing play. And also another downside that is kind of unique now to the Scarlet and Violet era is that Sableye previously was able to get Pokemon tool cards back, which at the time, of course, were considered items. But now, since item cards are no longer Pokemon tools, this sort of attack just in general is a bit worse overall. So for all you players who do have some nostalgia for the old Sableye, I just warn you, don't fall for this card. I think this is a total trap. Just play the quote unquote bad Regilucky, same attack, but it gets a trainer card instead of an item. Yes, it's not levelable or searchable, but I definitely think it outclasses this card. Next up, we have one of my favorite new Scarlet and Violet Pokemon, at least from the video games. Definitely not so much in the cards, unfortunately, but that's going to be Pawmot. Stage 2 Pokemon with free retreat, which actually is pretty cool. Definitely want to highlight that. 130 HP is pretty pitiful on this thing, but I will say the difference between 130 and 170 really doesn't mean much in this day and age. So anyways, moving on to this ability here, I definitely think this is what gives the card a little bit of promise. It says once during your turn, you may search your deck for a basic lightning energy and attach it to this Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. And then its attack for 2 lightning and a colorless does 230, and you discard all energy from this Pokemon. So if we just look at this attack, I think it draws a lot of comparisons to both the Magnezone EX we already looked at, but also, of course, Miraidon EX, the big star of these new lightning attackers. Even though this card does hit for a little bit more damage than Miraidon does, this is a stage 2 we have to remember. It's going to be a lot more difficult to get this thing set up. And in the case of Miraidon, I don't think that 10 damage difference actually makes a bit of a difference, because neither of these attacks on their own, even with Choice Bell or Defiant Band, really can push these numbers into one-shots on Pokemon V-Star. But Regilucky VMAX, on the other hand, can help these sort of attacks get pushed to that damage threshold, but Regilucky will not work on evolution Pokemon. And so if we're not actually taking one-hit KOs with Pawmot, there's just easier ways at sort of playing the 2-hit KO game. And I do think this ability is also kind of awkward too, because let's say our only Pawmot with energy gets knocked out. Well, if we do evolve into another one, we can attach return, we can use this ability, but then we're still another energy short of an attack. Now, I will say, if you're fortunate enough to be able to get multiple Pawmot into play, you can actually use these abilities over the course of several turns to get powered up. But just due to the difficulty of chaining stage 2s, I think it's going to be a little bit unrealistic to assume you're always going to have a backup Pawmot in play, just passively charging up energy with this ability. So I really do want to like this card, but the damage output I think is just a little too awkward to justify the hoops you have to jump through using a stage 2 like this. All right, now we finally have gotten to the king of all of these new lightning Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet. That is going to be Miraidon EX. Just right out the gate, without question, I think the best of these new lightning attackers we're getting in this set. Basic Pokemon, 220 HP, fighting weakness, 1 retreat. But I will say the 1 retreat in particular is actually pretty good here, just because we are getting that new Beach Court Stadium that will reduce the retreat cost of our basic Pokemon. But I think the standout attribute about this card is actually the ability here. It says once during your turn, you may search your deck for 2 basic lightning Pokemon and put them onto your bench, then shuffle your deck. So when I first read this card, I was thinking, okay, where is the then your turn ends clause of this ability? This definitely seems like the sort of ability they would have attached something like that onto, but that's not the case. We can actually use this every single turn of the game if we want to. And one of the other coolest parts about this is that it doesn't limit us to not getting additional Miraidon EX. So what that means is, just for the sake of example, when we use this ability, we can grab a Mareep and another Miraidon EX, and then use that second one to find 2 more additional basics. So this is a massive consistency booster for Lightning decks, which is great because I think a lot of the best Lightning cards in the format are based around swarming Pokemon into play, whether that's Pokemon like Flaffy that want 2 or 3 of these energy accelerators in play at all times, or even more recent cards like Regilucky VMAX that want a bunch of Regis into play to keep buffing your Lightning attackers. And then speaking of attacks, this thing does have one of its own. It's basically just Brave Blade, 2 Lightning and a colorless does 220, and during your next turn, this Pokemon can't attack. This isn't a crazy amount of damage by any stretch of imagination, but again, if we are thinking about Regieleki VMAX, this actually could be a really great partner for this thing, because with only 2 Regieleki VMAX in play, well, now we're hitting for 280, which knocks out all of the relevant Pokemon V-Star and Stage 1 Pokemon EX that we might run into. And honestly, I don't think it's going to be unreasonable to be able to get a 3rd Regieleki VMAX in play either, which then pushes you into one-shot range of Pokemon VMAX like Mew and some of the new Stage 2 EXs. And then of course, there's also the elephant in the room of how we get this thing powered up. Like I already mentioned, there is Flaffy, but also of course we have that brand new electricity generator, which could even allow for some insane turn 1 attacks with this thing. Yeah, this card I think is a complete home run. There's definitely some good hype for a handful of these new Pokemon EX, but this is absolutely one of the few you should be buying into. Next up, we have what is debatably the other best new Pokemon EX in the set, and that is going to be Gardevoir EX. Gardevoir is going to be a Stage 2 Pokemon, clocking in with 310 HP. Dark Weakness, which actually is kind of odd. I don't even remember the last time we had a Dark Weak Gardevoir, but it also has Fighting Resistance and a 2 retreat cost. So Gardevoir has an okay attack for 2 Psychic and a Colorless does 190, and you heal any special conditions on this Pokemon, but I think the big focus is going to be on this ability. It says, as often as you like during your turn, you may attach a basic Psychic Energy from your discard pile to one of your Psychic Pokemon. If you do, put 2 damage counters on that Pokemon, but you can't use this ability on a Pokemon that would be knocked out by the 2 damage counters. I feel like there's 3 things that are sort of inevitable in life: death, taxes, and getting a new broken Gardevoir card every time a new era of the TCG comes out. So when I first read this ability, I didn't think too much of it until I realized it said, as often as you like during your turn. Had this just been once during your turn, I don't think I would think too much about this card. But as a result, I think there's a ton of different ways we can take this thing. I think not only can we build around Gardevoir as sort of like a primary attacker, but also this could just be used to power up a number of other different Pokemon as well. So if we go down the attacking Gardevoir EX route, 190 doesn't look like a ton of damage, but even the tankiest Pokemon in the format are going to be 2-shot by this pretty consistently. And because we have built-in energy acceleration to Guardy, I think we could even maybe build some sort of healing strategy out with this. Cheryl definitely comes to mind for me because of course we can heal off all the damage on Gardevoir, then just re-accelerate the energy back onto it. Now, of course, Gardevoir does take a little bit of damage in the process, but with cards like maybe Radiant Serena or even the oddly decent Spicy Season Curry that could be paired with Gardevoir, we can actually knock that damage back down a little bit before heading into our opponent's next turn. But if you do decide to look to other attackers to maybe pair with Gardevoir, I literally don't have enough space on screen to dedicate everything you could play this with. But just to name a few examples you guys can start thinking about, we do have cards like Galarian Articuno, where you do have to discard your energy to snipe 120, but of course you can just re-accelerate that energy every turn. We have Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX, there's the Psychic Zacian V, there's Mewtwo V Union, there's even like Weirdeer V. There are so many different attacking options with Gardevoir. But really, I think the cherry on top for this card is the absolutely like broken evolution line it comes from. We have 2 good Kirlias. Of course, we have the one that can accelerate additional Kirlias into play, but we also have that one with the refinement ability that allows us to discard a card from our hand, maybe perhaps a Psychic Energy, and drawing 2 cards every turn. But there's also the Gardevoir back from Chilling Reign that can accelerate energy to play and draw cards. And we also have the Gallade with the Buddy Catch ability that can allow you to search your deck for a supporter. So if you guys do want to go with this sort of Cheryl strategy I just mentioned, even though Cheryl's only going to be probably like a 2 of in your deck, you can grab those on the exact turns that you want them. So if you guys can't tell, I'm pretty stoked on this card. I'm a huge Stage 2 fan. Gardevoir is right up my alley. Of course, the big issue though is just that this is a Stage 2. It is inherently going to be less consistent than some of the basic and Stage 1 decks out there. And there is kind of a lot going on. It seems like there's 100 cards you might want to include in a theoretical Gardevoir deck, and it might be kind of difficult whittling them down to just 60 cards. But I guess that's not the worst problem in the world to have, and definitely is not going to sour my excitement for this card at all. Next up, we have another Psychic Pokemon EX, and that is going to be Banette EX. But really, I think the big draw to this card, or at least what most people are talking about, is of course this first attack for a single Psychic Energy does 30, and your opponent can't play any item cards from their hand during their next turn. So for newer players to the game, this is very similar, of course, to the attack on Vikavolt V that has been seeing a good bit of play in the past couple months. Now, as you'll probably immediately notice, there's some pretty big differences here. Banette's going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon, unlike Vikavolt, so not only does that mean you have to inherently play more copies of this evolution line, But also, unlike Vikavolt, you can't have those big explosive turn 1s where you can item lock your opponent and maybe even get a good chunk of damage into play. Now, to be fair to Banette, Shuppet actually does have a pretty good attack. For a single colorless, it's 10, and you flip a coin of heads, they can't play item cards. But it's not a sure thing, and there are going to be times where your opponent goes free to play their item cards. But it is nice at the least that Shuppet does kind of tie into its evolution here. I think the other big downside to this card is the fact that it's only hitting for a measly 30 damage. If we compare this to Seismitoad EX from Furious Fist, that did the same amount of damage, but existed in a format where the most popular Pokemon topped at only near 200 HP, then compare that to Banette, which is in a format where there's Pokemon with over 300 HP. Yeah, this 30 damage is not cutting it. Seismitoad had a bunch of different damage modifiers, and even Vikavolt has things like Regieleki, Zapdos, etc. Banette really doesn't have a whole lot to fall back on. Yes, we do have even things like Old Cemetery or Defiant Band, but these things are all kind of situational depending on the deck you're going against. So if you're thinking about playing Banette in a similar way as we've seen things like Seismitoad of the past or even Vikavolt now, I think you should sort of just crush those dreams immediately. I don't think this is going to see play in a deck that is just trying to item lock your opponent, especially after Scarlet and Violet, where Pokemon tools are now being changed to no longer count as items, meaning your opponent is still going to be free to play cards like Choice Belt, Forest Seal Stone, etc. More than likely, we're going to be using this to just kind of slow our opponent down to build up to other better attacks, maybe even like this second attack that we have here. For just one additional colorless energy, you get to look at your opponent's hand and does 60 for each trainer card in your opponent's hand. So this definitely could give Banette some sort of heavy-hitting mid to late game attack, because since your opponent can't play any items, they're going to have excess trainer cards just kind of sitting in their hand, clogging it up, allowing Poltergeist to maybe take some big KOs. And much like its first attack, this second attack is also very similar to some other good attacks we've had in the past, with probably the more recent one being the Gengar Mimikyu GX. But at the end of the day, guys, I'm still kind of left scratching my head what to do with this thing. I mean, being a Banette card means we could theoretically use the other Banette back from Lost Origin that can get supporters out of the discard pile. So maybe that could be cool, especially if you're playing some Disruption supporters. But either way, guys, I think the broader point I'm just trying to drive home here is that I don't think we're building around this first attack. I know a lot of people have nostalgia for cards like Seismitoad and are having a lot of fun with Vikavolt right now, but this card is not on the same power level. Yeah, it does have a little bit more HP, but even if we're item locking our opponent, having to still 4, 5, or 6 shot them with this attack, again, it's completely unacceptable. I don't care what people on Twitter have been saying about this card. Do not buy into the hype. And I think both these attacks are probably too good to ignore, but I definitely think this card's potential is more in the long term rather than the short term. Next up, we have a brand new Florges. Most of the stats are pretty irrelevant on this card, including its attack, unfortunately, but the ability here is a little bit more interesting. As long as this Pokemon is in play, your Pokemon have no weakness. Normally, if I looked at a card like this, I wouldn't think too much of it. It has a decent ability, but it's on a Stage 2 Pokemon that you're probably going to have to rare candy into. I mean, even in the rotation, we're losing a Chandelure, which did something extremely similar, though just slightly worse than this. But I guess the reason I want to highlight this card is that I do think we are going to enter into a format that is a little bit slower and more conducive to evolution Pokemon than we have had in recent memory. I think the vast majority of decks out there really aren't looking to play something like this, like your Lost Box decks or even some of your bigger basic decks with like 200-ish HP. I think it's going to be more of a consideration for more of these like Stage 2 style decks that could pop up throughout the Scarlet and Violet era, with Gardevoir currently being the main one I think you would ever want to consider this in. The evolution line comes from Fog Crystal, which you're already going to be playing. You might already be playing a couple copies of Rare Candy anyways, and if Gardevoir does start becoming very dominant and Dark decks start becoming more viable, you will need some way at countering all of the anti-meta stuff that's trying to counter you. That being said though, I still don't have a whole lot of hope for this card. The main weakness eliminating cards that really come to mind for me that I've seen play have been Weakness Policy and Weakness Guard Energy, both of which are far easier to play than cramming a Stage 2 line in your deck. And even then, those cards weren't that common in most decks. So even though there might be a couple of uses for this ability, the card still just might be too clunky, and there might even be other ways at countering some of the popular decks that are trying to hit you for weakness at any given point. Next up, we have another card that's been seeing a good bit of hype, and that's going to be this puny little Klefki that we have here. It's a basic Pokemon, 70 HP, Meta Weakness, 1 retreat cost. And just before we get to the rest of the card, 70 HP, already great, level ball searchable, and being a Psychic Pokemon also gives it access to Fog Crystal as a target for Psychic decks too. But looking over to its ability, it says as long as this Pokemon is your active Pokemon, each player's basic Pokemon in play have no abilities. And then just to briefly throw it out there, it does have an attack for a colorist is 10, and you discard a tool from your opponent's active. But clearly the ability here is why people have been talking about this card. It kind of reminds me of both the Empoleon V that we have right now, and also kind of like the Wobbuffet back from Phantom Forces. So if we do want to compare this to Empoleon, there are definitely some differences. Empoleon only works for your opponent's Pokemon, whereas Klefki is going to shut off your basic abilities. But the big trade-off, and it is a pretty big one, is that this shuts off all basic abilities, not just those without a rule box, which is the case with Empoleon. So of course, not only can we shut off things like Comfey, Cramorant, and other one prize Pokemon like that, but also this is going to shut off things like Lumineon V, Genesect V, and some of these strong multi-prize abilities that a lot of decks rely on to get set up. In a way, this card actually really reminds me of the Trash Avalanche Garbodor from the early Sun and Moon era, which might sound like a weird comparison to make. But what I mean by that is prior to Garbodor's release, decks were generally a lot faster. And the introduction of Garbodor into the format forced decks to be built differently and forced them to slow down so that the evolution-based decks that were emerging could actually see play alongside some of these previously more aggressive, largely basic and EX-dominated decks. Likewise, if a ton of decks are playing Klefki, decks like Lost Box or Mew, just as easy examples, are going to have to rethink how they're going to build their decks. They're going to have to play cards like Canceling Cologne or higher escape rope counts, maybe more physical supporters. And even if these, again, more aggressive decks do adapt to Klefki, they're still taking a hit to their consistency in some way, which again, like with Garbodor, might allow for some of these upcoming Stage 1 and Stage 2 EXs to be able to compete with them. So I could easily see a world where a lot of decks are just playing 4 Klefki in addition to whatever evolution they're playing, just so they can start this thing and try to slow down their opponent while they're getting set up. I know this card doesn't look like much, especially when we compare it to some of the heavy hitters of this set, like the Miraidon EX and Gardevoir EX we already looked at, but don't get it confused. This little guy actually is, I think, probably one of the best cards we're getting in this set. So again, I'm really curious to see how, if at all, this is going to impact deck building in the future. But big thumbs up, very eager to start experimenting with this card. Next up, we have our first Darkspawn card. Going to be a stage 1 here, 90 HP, so obviously right out the gate, very solid, since that does make this evolution line level while searchable. But we're really just looking at it for this ability. It says prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's fire Pokemon, and this Pokemon can't be burned. But even though this ability looks oddly specific and maybe a little too situational, we've actually seen several cards with this ability see play. Probably the big ones that stand out in my mind are going to be the Araquanid back from Sun and Moon, and also towards the end of the Sun and Moon era, we saw a Bronzong that saw play in a variety of control decks. Now, the big issue that Darkspawn has compared to those is that fire Pokemon just really aren't generally that great right now. Like, yeah, we do have Radiant Zard, but beyond that, I mean, really guys, what fire Pokemon are looking to see a lot of play? I mean, we do have a decent amount of okay fire Pokemon, like there's Moltres, there's Charizard V-Star, even the new Arcanine EX isn't the worst thing in the world, but these Pokemon just aren't popular enough to where I think decks should be looking to hard counter them with a card like Darkspawn here. I think a lot of the fire Pokemon we have are pretty solid, but I think they're just lacking decent energy acceleration right now. And of course, if that changes, decks might have to look at something like Darkspawn if they're not able to remedy their fire matchup otherwise. So I don't have too many positive feelings about this card for the moment, but the ability's been good before, so it might be worth having in your binder just for when the time finally comes. But for the moment, probably not going to do a whole lot. Next up, we have our first Houndstone. This is going to be another Stage 1 Psychic type, 140 HP, Dart Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and a 3 Retreat cost. Just has one single attack here for 2 Psychic Energy, does 80 plus 10 for each Psychic Pokemon in your discard pile. So actually kind of a cool attack that we have here. In fact, it's almost identical to the single strike Lycanroc that we also have, which might be setting off some red flags because it hasn't really been that great up until this point. But in Houndstone, and I guess Lycanroc's defense as well, we have seen a number of these attacks be good over the years, with some of the more notable examples being the Vespiquen and the Plasma Flareon. And a little bit more recently, we also did see some things like Mad Party pop up and find a little bit of success. So it's not completely out of the question a deck like this could succeed. But I think my big issue I have with this card compared to some of these other decks I just mentioned is this pesky double Psychic Energy attack cost. I know it doesn't seem like a huge deal, but when a deck like Mad Party that can attack for a single attachment struggles to see play consistently, it's only going to be that much harder for a card like this. But if I am going to entertain this theoretical deck idea, I think this card actually does have a fair bit of cards that synergize well with it. So of course we have the Gardevoir evolution line, which I think the entire line can actually help with Houndstone. We have Curlias that can discard additional Psychic Pokemon, and we also have Gardevoir EX that can maybe cheat that additional Psychic energy into play whenever you find yourself needing that extra attachment. There's even the Galarian Articuno V that can discard additional Psychic Pokemon from your hand. And I actually do want to give a shout out to Greavard as well, it's pre-evolution. It's the same attack but for 1 Psychic energy and doesn't have the 80 base damage. I'm always a fan of that. I get so annoyed whenever we get Pokemon where it's just like 1 energy for 10, 2 for 20. And the card has like no synergy with the rest of its evolution line. So it does have that going for it. But to really put in perspective the power level of this card, if we want to take a one shot just on Pokemon V-Star, let's ignore Stage 2 EXs and Pokemon V Max, you're going to need 20 Pokemon in the discard pile. And that's in addition to whatever Pokemon you have on the field too. So realistically, guys, you're going to need to play probably close to 30-ish Pokemon, which of course means if you're playing all of these Pokemon, that comes at the cost of other cards you would otherwise want to include in your deck. I do think this card is okay, and I think you can probably build a functioning Houndstone deck, but I'm just concerned this card's not really at the same power level as some of the other more dominant decks that we're probably going to see in the post-rotation format. Next up, we have our very first Annihilape card. So of course, this thing is the new evolution for Primeape. It's a stage 2 with 2 attacks here. The first one for a fighting energy does 70 for each prize card your opponent has already taken. And the second attack for 2 fighting energy does 170, and this Pokemon does 50 to itself. So I will say, I think this is a serviceable card. Like, there's nothing fundamentally awful about it. Like, the damage to energy ratio on these attacks is pretty decent. The 50 damage you take with the second attack most of the time is irrelevant since you're just going to be one shot anyways. And you do have some pretty insane late game one hit KO potential. Like if your opponent has taken 5 prize cards for 1 fighting, you're going to knock out anything that's in your path. But despite all this, I still don't think I can probably get on board with this card. And as sad as it is, it's just kind of because it's a stage 2 Pokemon. For the majority of the game, you're just going to be 2-shotting things with this second attack. And like I said, even though it does do a serviceable amount of damage that's going to consistently 2-hit KO things, guys, there's just easier ways at 2-shotting Pokemon in the format that don't require a stage 2 and multiple manual energy attachments to do so. I mean, we do have some ways at getting around that pesky second energy here. We do still have Gutsy Pickaxe, though with a Ranger leaving us in the rotation, that card definitely gets a bit worse. And then there's still things like Raihan, which are, very turn specific, and you can't always find it at the exact time that you want to play it. So I think Annihilape's first outing in the TCG is decent. It's not an awful card by any means, guys. But even with hitting the new Miraidon EX for weakness, I don't think this card is quite at the power level it needs to be. Next up, we have a new Lucario. Just for a single fighting energy, does 30 plus 120 more if any of your fighting Pokemon were knocked out by damage from an attack from your opponent's Pokemon during their last turn. We're no stranger to these sorts of revenge style effects. We just saw the Zamazenta come out in Crown Zenith, which has kind of a similar attack. We've seen things like the Rally Back Shaman, so there is plenty of precedent for an attack like this to be good. But you might notice one of the big differences between Lucario and some of these other Pokemon I just mentioned is that this is a stage 1, not a basic, which makes this a little bit more difficult to actually pull off. I think one of the strengths of being a basic with those other cards is that your opponent can take a KO and then you can kind of surprise them with your revenge style attack. But the issue here is you're going to have to preemptively bench a Riolu, and your opponent can sort of play around knowing that there is a Lucario maybe coming their way on the next turn or so. So I think if this card were to see play, I think this would ever just sort of slot in as a one of an existing Lucario deck. So think of the new Lucario EX that's going to be coming out, or even that Lucario with the Roaring Resolve ability. But as you can probably tell, that's kind of the issue. Because this attack only activates when a fighting Pokemon was knocked out, these are largely the type of decks this card will have to slot into, and they really aren't looking to be top tier archetypes by any means. So even though I do think this is a decent revenge style attack, since we can one-shot things like Miraidon EX and Arceus V-Star, I just don't think the right deck exists yet for this card to slot into. Next up, I think we have our first great fighting Pokemon of the set. That's going to be Hawlucha. 70 HP and the 1 retreat are a little bit notable, since Level Ball and Beach Court can be potentially cards Hawlucha can abuse, but really the reason to ever play this card would be for this ability. When you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench during your turn, you may choose 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon and put 1 damage counter on each of them. This is certainly a welcome inclusion in Scarlet and Violet, since we are losing Galarian Zigzagoon in the upcoming rotation. And if we just compare Goon to Hawlucha, there's definitely some pros and cons between both cards. The big downside with Hawlucha here is that it is only limited to bench Pokemon, But we do have the added benefit of being able to choose 2 Pokemon instead. And that extra Pokemon does matter a little bit more, especially since we're entering into a format without Scoop Up Net. So I think this ability is kind of smartly designed, sort of makes up a little bit for the fact that we no longer can sort of spam this ability as much as we could before. And even after the rotation, there's definitely going to be a handful of decks that will want to set up these additional damage counters. The obvious examples are going to be cards like Hisuian Samurott V-Star or the new Gyarados EX that we already looked at that do more damage if your opponent's active has damage counters on them. But I will say Hawlucha does feel a little bit weak in those decks just because you can't actually target the active and you're kind of forced to preemptively set up damage counters with this thing. However, I think the styles of decks that might look to Hawlucha a little bit more are going to be Lost Box decks. Zigzagoon was frequently a very important card for things like the Mirror Match to be able to set up additional damage counters on Comfies, for Sableye to come in and clean up those knockouts. And Hawlucha actually does enable some pretty cool plays in that regard, because the big issue with your Sableye plays in the Mirror Match is that 2 Comfies total up to 140 HP, and so you would have to go like Zigzagoon, Scoop Up Net, Zigzagoon to set up those 2 additional damage counters, but Hawlucha just does that for us here. Now, while we're on that topic, the other big trade-off to Hawlucha is that we are losing Quick Ball in the rotation, so decks are going to be replacing that most of the time with Nest Ball, which means we actually can't activate this ability. And that's not really an issue strictly with Hawlucha. I think really all of these sort of coming into play abilities get a good bit worse after the rotation, but nevertheless, the ability is still good. I still think decks are going to be eyeing this down, and there are still viable Pokemon search options like Level Ball, and even some scoop-up style effects in the format like the new Penny Supporter, all totaling up to, I think, making Hawlucha still a pretty decent card, even though this probably won't be as dominant as something like Zigzagoon before it. Next up, we have our first Paradox Pokemon. That is going to be Great Tusk EX. And side note, is it just me, or is it a little bit lame that these Paradox Pokemon don't have anything unique about them compared to normal cards? Kind of a weird thing. I would have thought at least their card templates would have looked different or something, but either way, that's a side tangent. Let's take a look at this thing. Basic Pokemon with a whopping 250 HP. So a very tanky boy that we have here. Psychic Weakness, which does mean this card is going to be in the crosshair of cards like Mew VMAX and Gardevoir. So that's definitely an L for it, though in the case of Mew, you can at least tech Drapion pretty easily to maybe help you in that matchup. But taking a look at its attacks, its first one for a fighting does 40, and you discard a Stadium card in play. And then its second attack for 3 fighting does 250, but this Pokemon does take 50 in the process. So even though this second attack actually hits for some pretty good numbers, with a Choice Belt, we're going to be one-shotting pretty much any Pokemon V-Star. The 50 damage you take is honestly kind of a bummer, because it sort of nullifies what makes this card decent, and that's the massive HP it has. But I guess the thought is, if your opponent can one-shot you anyways, if we're still in a largely one-hit KO-oriented format, the 50 damage a lot of the time isn't going to matter. But if you're not content with giving up your tank ability with this card, there are a handful of cards you can play with this. We have that new Rock Chestplate Pokemon tool that will reduce damage to your fighting Pokemon. And then, of course, we do still have things like Radiant Gardevoir in the format. But if you do decide to go down the sort of tanking route with this thing, well, then you're foregoing your damage modifiers. And then we still have to address the other elephant in the room, no pun intended here, and that's going to be this annoying attack cost. 3 fighting energy is a lot to ask for, because there's no colorless energy on here. We can't really look to things like the Lost Engine. And I think that's really just going to leave us with cards like Gutsy Pickaxe, Raihan, and or maybe the new Miraidon EX to help get this thing set up. So I think until this card gets a little bit easier to power up, I'm actually not a big fan of this card, despite some of the good attributes it has sort of at a quick glance. And next up, we have the other big mascot Pokemon of the set. That's going to be Miraidon EX. So at a glance, very similar actually to the Miraidon EX. Has actually the same attack, only for fighting energy instead of lightning, but does have a couple of trade-offs as well. Does have a little bit more HP, though at the cost of a higher retreat cost and probably a much worse weakness, since, as I've mentioned throughout talking about the rest of these fighting Pokemon, this card will have to worry about things like Mew VMAX and Gardevoir EX, which both might end up gatekeeping this card a little bit. But this card does have a really good ability. It says once during your turn, you may attach up to 2 basic fighting energy cards from your discard pile to your basic fighting Pokemon in any way that you like, but your turn does end. So we definitely could just use this to power up Miraidon itself and sort of play this like a fighting pseudo Zacian V-style deck, if you will. 220 is a decent amount of damage, and I guess if you do have a Choice Belt plus Grant, you actually can take one-shots on Pokemon V-Star, so that is worth highlighting. even though that is admittedly quite clunky to try to chain throughout the course of the game. But you also could just use this to power up other different fighting Pokemon. You know, we just took a look at Great Tusk, which actually is a slightly heavier hitting attacker and requires one less damage modifier to get a one-shot. And I will point out, technically, we can use this to power up evolution Pokemon as well, just because we can always accelerate the energy to our basics and then evolve into their evolutions on the following turn, sort of getting around the limitation of this ability. But guys, I have two big issues here. The first one is that there's just not a lot of really great fighting Pokemon worth accelerating to. And the second, and maybe even more important one right now, is that if you whiff this turn 1 ability, this card gets exponentially worse because you really want to start doing damage on turn 2, not sort of cobbling together energy into your discard to pull off a turn 2 ability. You know, if we are trying to play Miraidon EX, we need Miraidon in play, the basic we want to accelerate to, probably something different in the active spot that can soak up a hit. We want an energy attachment for turn, and we need to get 2 energy into the discard pile to accelerate with this ability. Guys, that's a lot to ask for on turn 1. It's not out of the question, you know, with cards like Pokestop, Ultra Ball, Trekking Shoes, etc., you can sort of turbo through your deck a little bit to have a shot at setting this up. But even if the stars align and you do get your Exodia turn 1 sort of combo off, what are we really accelerating to? That being said, though, I do like this card. The ability is admittedly great. The attack is decent as well. But I just think fighting is going to need a little bit more support for this to become anything more than like a tier 3 or tier 2 deck. So keeping the Pokemon EX train chugging along here, we have Toxicroak up next. New Stage 1 Pokemon, 250 HP, Fighting Weakness, and a 2 Retreat cost. Its first attack for just 1 Dark Energy, you search your deck for up to 2 cards and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. And its second attack for a Dark and 2 Colorless is 120, and your opponent's active is Poison, and they take 6 instead of 1 in between turns. So I know the attack you guys probably want to hear about is the second one, but I actually do want to briefly point out something about this first one. Even though I think in the case of Toxicroak EX, this is a pretty bad attack since you don't want to be using it on turn 2. But I think these styles of attacks, just in general, do get a bit better after the rotation since we are losing Marnie. And I don't think Judge, honestly, is going to be near as widespread as Marnie was. So worst case scenario, if you do somehow find yourself playing Toxicroak EX in a deck, and you do whiff the turn 2 attack, you can fall back on Nasty Plot here. And more than likely, your hand is going to be a lot safer than it was in previous formats. So just something small I do want to highlight about these attacks going forward. But again, bad attack for stage 1. The second attack here is the one we would ever, I think, really want to try to use. So right off the rip, no pun intended. Man, I am on fire with these bad puns in this set review today. It's going to do 120, but really actually only 100 once you factor in double turbo into the mix. So 100 for 3 is, man, that is gross. But that poison damage does sort of make up for it a little bit. Once we factor in poison into the mix, we're pretty comfortably two-shotting most things in the format. And with Radiant Hisuian Sneasel, you can actually push that damage a little bit higher as well. But I gotta say, Toxicroak definitely feels like it was victim of the rotation. This card, I think, lost quite a few cards that would have made it a little bit more appealing to me. There was actually another Toxicroak that you could have played in this deck that could have increased your poison damage a little bit more. We're also losing Galar Mine, where without it, your opponent more than likely can just sort of retreat out of this poison. Unless you, of course, decide to play something like Spidops EX in your deck, which actually really isn't out of the realm of possibility. And even if your opponent can't retreat, a lot of decks are still playing high counts of switch cards. And if this poison damage isn't sticking, we're effectively just doing 160 for 3, which again isn't the worst thing in the world. But if we're playing the two-shot game, guys, there's way better Pokemon we could use to sort of play that game here. And even though this is a dark Pokemon, we actually can't even one-shot Mewtwo or Gardevoir EX, which is kind of insane. Because of course the poison damage doesn't double for weakness. So we would only hit Mewtwo for in total 260, excluding additional damage modifiers like Radiant Hisuian Sneasel. So we actually still would need Choice Belt or Defiant Band to hit for the numbers we need to. So yeah, there's good things about being Dark type, like having access to Energy Acceleration with Dark Patch or Galarian Moltres and Energy Switch, but if our theoretical Toxicroak EX deck doesn't even have the benefit of one-shotting Pop Your Dark weak Pokemon, yeah, that just might be the final straw for me. Next up, we have another new Pokemon that is a brand new stage 2 of a previous Pokemon that is going to be Kingambit. It's going to be Bisharp's evolution. And I did check, even though there is a kind of decent Bisharp in the format, it doesn't really synergize well with this one, unfortunately. So nothing really too special about its pre-evolutions, but Kingambit here, really the enticing part of it is going to be this ability. It says, as long as this Pokemon is in play, the attacks of your basic Pokemon do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. Okay, a permanent plus 30 at all times in play. That's not something I think we can completely write off. And this thing does stack. So in theory, if you can somehow manage to get 2 or 3 stage 2 King Gambits in play, you're going to be hitting for an extra 60, maybe even 90 damage per turn with your basic Pokemon, which is great. That actually does push some of the Pokemon format, most notably the different legendary dogs, into a damage that can one-shot a lot of stage 1 EXs and Pokemon V-Star running around. But if we ever were looking at an effect like this for our basic Pokemon decks out there, I think this card does compete a little bit with Ludicolo. Both have a very similar vibe to them. They're stage 2s that buff your basic Pokemon. King Gambit, of course, is a permanent plus 30, with Ludicolo, on the other hand, doing 100 damage at the cost of it only being a coming into play ability. But I've got to say, I think overall, plus 100 is more often more meaningful than a plus 30. Because let's go back to the legendary dogs, or legendary beasts, I should say. If both players have a full bench, you're hitting for 220, and a plus 30 can be good against maybe some of the new Pokemon EX we looked at, but against most things, that is going to be a little bit shy of a knockout, and your opponent can play around that damage output. Whereas with Ludicolo, more often than not, that 100 damage is going to get you where you need to go. Ludicolo also does have the benefit of having access to Irida for the exact turns that you might want to play it. Right now, if I am going to play one of these cards, I am leaning more towards Ludicolo, and even still, that's a card that doesn't really see a ton of play. And as a result, King Gambit's probably just going to be binder fodder for the moment, despite it having a good ability. It's just unfortunate that it is on a stage 2 that is a little bit tricky to get in play and doesn't have a ton of support. Next up, guys, we have actually one of my favorite Pokemon from Scarlet and Violet. That's going to be Revavroom. Feel free to roast me in the comments, but I don't know, something about this Pokemon, I just love it. I know it's an engine block Pokemon, and it seems kind of absurd, but I don't know. I always thought this guy was really cool. And I'm actually really happy it's getting a pretty decent card here, too. It's a new stage 1 with an absolutely abysmal attack. We're probably never going to use this, but the ability actually is really solid. It says you must discard an energy from your hand in order to use this ability, but once during your turn, you may draw until you have 6 cards in your hand. So imagine if we took Bibarel and took Radiant Greninja and kind of smashed them together into one card here, which, hey, I don't think we can complain too much about. Both of those are very solid, popular support Pokemon in the format. And as a result, I think there's really 2 ways we can look at Revavroom. I think the more optimistic outlook on this card is, hey, we're taking these 2 great Pokemon and just putting them into one. I might no longer need to play both Bibarel and Radiant Greninja. I can condense them to just this one stage 1 instead. If we compare this directly to Bibarel, well, we get to draw more cards with this, and we also get to lower our hand size before we do it. It also has more HP, which means maybe decks like Lost Box can't as easily pick this off the bench. But then I think the more pessimistic outlook on Revavroom is, well, yeah, it's Bibarel and Radiant Greninja pushed into one card, but now instead we have an overall less consistent effect. Because in the case of Bibarel, yeah, you don't draw quite as many, but far more decks can potentially make use of its ability, since you don't have to discard specifically an energy whenever you want to use it. And if you do have energy you want to discard, well, a lot of times you might just want your Radiant Greninja in play instead of having to set up a stage 1. And depending on the deck, a lot of the time whenever you use this ability, you might be drawing a similar amount of cards to what Radiant Greninja would have gotten you anyways. So as a player, I think you definitely could look at this card sort of in either light. And I think both conclusions are kind of right here. I think Revavroom, even though this ability is, to be honest, great, I think it's very limited in terms of the potential decks that could use this, because it has to compete with the versatility of Bibarel. It has to compete with Radiant Greninja being easier to get in play, and it also might have to compete with the Kirlia engine, which right now is potentially looking to be a soft replacement for the Inteleon engine we've seen decks make use of. So you guys can tell, I have pretty mixed thoughts on this card. I really want to love this thing. I was actually really high on this card when we first saw it get revealed, but I've kind of come back down to earth since then, and I do think this card's application is a lot more limited than it initially seemed. So I'm going to land pretty much squarely in the middle on this thing. I think the ability is great, but it's just going to require a very certain type of deck that doesn't pair quite as well with some of these other stage 1s, and maybe is looking to play a different Radiant Pokemon other than Greninja, and might force you to land on Revavroom instead to replace that effect. Really cool card, just not sure where it's going to find a home just yet. And next up, we have the final of the 2 Paradox Pokemon we're getting. That's going to be Iron Treads EX. So we saw the prehistoric Donphan. Now we have like the weird mecha future Donphan thing. And I'll say this card is probably just as bad as the actual Pokemon looks here. I think all of its stats are pretty average on this thing. And then its attacks probably a little bit less than, if we're being honest. The first one's Triple Laser for 3 colorless energy, does 30 to 3 of your opponent's Pokemon. So a little bit of spread damage is cool, assuming your opponent doesn't put Manaphy into play. But as you've probably heard some in the community talk about, this is the same attack that was on Registeel EX, back from Dragons Exalted over 10 years ago in a format where Pokemon capped out at 180 HP. Comparatively, this is on a Pokemon in a format where the most popular Pokemon are capping out between 310 and 330 HP. HPs have essentially doubled, and this attack has basically done nothing in that time span. So I don't think we're ever really looking at this first attack. I think the far more interesting of the two is the second. It does cost a whopping 3 metal and a colorless that does 160, and you switch this with one of your bench Pokemon. So let's put a pin in the energy cost for a second. We'll come back to that. I think just looking at this damage and this effect, this is actually a pretty decent attack. I think the idea here is we use this and promote things like Diancie or Klefki to maybe annoy our opponent on their next turn. But this card really just does not have the sort of support it needs, partially because we're losing Air Balloon in the rotation, which means we will have to run copies of Beach Court or maybe even other switching cards, which definitely is doable. But I think the bigger challenge for this card is the massive 4 energy attack cost that we have here. And unfortunately, Metal Saucer is a casualty to the upcoming rotation, making it extremely difficult to ever power up a card like this. You know, as I was working on this set review, I was combing through the card pool, trying to see if there was any hope for this. And really, I think the Magnezone with the Giga Magnet ability is probably going to be this card's best bet. But we're talking about getting a stage 2 into play that needs to hit us 3 energy with an ability that's kind of unreliable. And sort of the cherry of awfulness on top of it all is that your opponent can still get around cards like Diancie if they want to. Escape Rope is not going anywhere and is going to be a card so many decks are still going to be playing after the rotation. So even if you do manage to get your insane combo set up and try to promote Diancie and keep your Iron Tread safe every turn, well, I think a lot of times your opponent can still just gust around this thing either way. So you guys can tell I'm not very excited about this card. You know, divorced of the energy cost, I think the second attack does have potential. And who knows, this actually might be a card we should keep in mind as new cards are added to the card pool. And maybe as Metal Pokemon get some more support over the next however many sets, we can revisit this. But for the moment, I just think the odds are stacked totally against this card. Next up, we have an unexpectedly interesting Staraptor card. We're looking at this mainly for the first attack here. For 2 colorless energy, does 60, and during your opponent's next turn, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks of basic Pokemon. And then its second attack for an additional colorless does 180, and you discard an energy from this Pokemon. 180 isn't awful, especially if we're using double turbo to get this powered up. That's still 160. That's a nice 2-shotting number to hit for. But clearly, we're not going to build around doing 160 on a stage 2. It's just kind of an added bonus that we have access to. The first attack is what has far more potential here. So you can think of this card as a stage 2 version of Ice Cube that does slightly less damage, but has more HP and can be powered up a little bit more flexibly. And as we've seen, Ice Cube can be a very annoying Pokemon for certain decks to deal with, since if they're playing exclusively basics and you start using this attack, unless your opponent is able to go Escape Rope Boss to clear this effect away, they're going to be locked out of the game at that point. And even though you're not doing much damage, it almost doesn't even really matter since you're not taking damage on any turns. Now, even though I do love the added HP we have on Staraptor, it's kind of unfortunate we're losing some key cards that would really help this. I think one of the big ones is going to be Big Parasol. So hypothetically, if we are playing against some sort of Lost Zone base deck, even though things like Cramorant can't attack Staraptor, well, Sableye can still place damage counters, which isn't technically damage, it's an effective an attack. And I guess, yes, you can play like Espeon VMAX if you really want to, but now you're giving your opponent targets on the bench to maybe deal with. And despite the extra HP on this thing being great, because it's a stage 2, this thing is not nearly as splashable in decks as Ice Cube was in the past. Because of this, you probably actually can't even play this as like a 101 or a 111. You're probably going to have to play a thicker evolution line and commit more to this sort of basic denying strategy, which might be an issue since there are also decks out there that have evolution Pokemon or at least a mix of evolution and basic attackers. Staraptor is definitely an okay card, but I think there's probably too many holes in this strategy for it to be effective. Next up, we're going to check out Skwovet. And yes, you did hear that right. We are not checking out Greedent here. The pre-evolution is definitely, I think, far and away the better of the two cards. And we're just looking at this card for its ability. It says once during your turn, you may use this ability, you shuffle your hand and put it on the bottom of your deck, then draw a single card. So yeah, we're basically trying to Marnie ourselves into one. Essentially, you could think of it that way. Which I think at a glance sounds pretty awful. But even though we're going to be putting ourselves into a 1-card hand, there's actually a good bit of times where you do want to play your hand down to a low hand size. An easy example of this is with a card like Barrel, where you draw until you have 5 cards in your hand, but if you have a big clunky handful of cards you can't play down, but you really need to dig to hit a specific card for turn, well, with this Skwovet, you can now dump all of those cards that were previously clunking up your hand, draw a card, and now actually still be able to refill your hand even more. I'm still not yet sure if this would just end up being like a 61st card that doesn't make it quite into the list of any decks running Barrel, but I do think if you are going to play Barrel, I think you have to at least consider this card. But I think more interestingly, this card could pair well with a number of different supporter cards that do require you to have just a single card in hand. Obviously, the most notable ones are going to be the different Mustard supporters, but there also is that kind of recent Brandon supporter card. And when you combo this with the Dragon Altaria, you can search your deck for, let's say, Rapid Strike Mustard. You Skwovet to draw that as the only card in your hand, then play Mustard to be able to get a Rapid Strike Pokemon into play and get your setup going. Now, unfortunately, I think a lot of the times with these Mustard cards, these are effects you would probably want as early as like turn 1. You're really not trying to do this effect on like turn 3 or 4, I think most of the time. And the fact that you would need Altaria here means you are going to have to wait until at least turn 2, unless you do decide to play cards maybe like Switch Cups instead as an alternate way of stacking the top card of your deck for Skwovet here. I'm not yet sold on that strategy, and like I mentioned in the case of a card like Barrel, this could just be seen as more of a win more style card than one that you really need as a necessity in your deck. So I think this card is really cool, but I think I'm just going to have to get hands on with it and need a little bit more convincing before I jump on the bandwagon with it. Next up, we have a new Indeedee card. The 90 HP actually is solid just because, of course, we can search this out with Level Ball. But the attack that's kind of interesting on this card is the first one. For a Colorless Energy, you search your deck for a card that evolves from one of your Pokemon in play and play it on that Pokemon to evolve it, then shuffle your deck. So in a way, this card kind of reminds me of Radiant Eternatus in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. So what I mean by that is we've seen people experiment with Radiant Eternatus because, you know, if you're benching these unevolved Pokemon V that only have like around 200-ish HP, for a lot of decks, that's not a difficult amount of damage to have to do to take a KO. And so by playing something like Radiant Eternatus, or now in this case Indeedee, you can actually just get your evolution immediately into play and have it set up safely on your bench, potentially out of one-shot range of your opponent on their next turn. The thing that Indeedee does that I do like is that you can try to go for the same strategy that you would go for with Eternatus, but you can theoretically play different Radiant Pokemon in your deck. The trade-off, of course, is that this attack is really only good on your first turn going second, whereas Eternatus is good even on the first turn of the game. But the other upside that Indeedee has is that this isn't limited to Pokemon V Max. We can actually use this with Pokemon V-Star or, of course, the new Pokemon EX, or obviously single prize Pokemon as well, but honestly, I don't think we're probably using Indeedee for that. So I do think there are some cool plays we can do this, much like in the case of Eternatus, as I keep referencing. But this card has, I think, a few too many downsides for me to really want to consider this. The first one being one that I've kind of already alluded to, where you really can only play this on the first turn of the game going second. But the other downside in my head is that if we're leaving a Pokemon in the active spot at the end of our first turn, I think there's other Pokemon I'd rather just have there. Even just looking within Scarlet and Violet, we have the new Klefki coming out, which is also a Level Ball searchable Pokemon that can kind of slow down your opponent to a screeching halt if they are reliant on basic abilities with things like Genesect, Comfey, etc. And in the case of that card, we also don't need to commit energy to it to get the effect that we want out of it. So unless we get some sort of Pokemon in the future that has a very oppressive ability as soon as we evolve into it, maybe some sort of ability that locks items or abilities as an example, I don't think this card otherwise will be that great. So up next, we have our final Pokemon EX of the set. That's going to be Oinkologne EX. So, Stage 1 Pokemon, 260 HP, 2 retreat cost, fighting weakness, and its first attack for a Colorless Energy does 10 plus 30 more for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And its second attack for 3 Colorless Energy does 210, and you flip a coin if tailsless Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. So the second attack, just really quick, is kind of okay. I definitely imagine you would play maybe a couple copies of Double Turbo Energy just for certain turns where you might need a bigger amount of damage. But I think most of the time, this first attack is really going to be the star of the show here. And this is basically the same attack that we have on the Kleavor that has popped up in some of these Zoroark Toolbox decks, but now it's only for a single Colorless Energy. So if your opponent does have a full bench, you're going to be hitting for 160, which honestly isn't a bad amount. That's a nice two-shotting amount of damage. But even if they only have 3 or 4 bench Pokemon, I think that's still a decent enough amount of damage for, I think, what this card is trying to accomplish. So Oinkologn's certainly not the heaviest hitting new Pokemon EX we're getting, but the thing I do like about this card is its tanking potential that it's going to have. Because this is only a colorless energy, that means we can actually abuse V-Guard energy, which is now going to force Pokemon V to do at least 290 if they want to knock you out. But on top of that, there's other damage reduction modifiers like Radiant Gardevoir and or Full Face Guard. And I think it's actually going to be pretty easy to push this card into an amount of HP to where very few Pokemon are going to be one-shotting it. And even though we're losing cards like Hyper Potion in the rotation, Oinkologne actually has access to quite a few other good healing cards, with probably the most notable ones being both Sharon's Care and Cheryl. Which one of those is going to be better suited for Oinkologne, I think it's a little bit up in the air, just because they do have their own pros and cons. Sharon's Care will preserve your energy, but does come at the cost of needing an additional Lechonk in play for you to be able to re-evolve into, and rebenching a low HP Pokemon with it. Cheryl, on the other hand, does discard your energy, but of course you can heal all of your Oinkolognes, and you don't have to rebench any low HP Pokemon for your opponent. And even though your opponent can play around this first attack, like I mentioned, guys, you're probably going to play at least a couple of double turbos just to maybe use Heavy Stamp from time to time when you do need that little additional buff and damage. But obviously the big trade-off with this card, though, is that it's largely dependent on what your opponent is doing. And even if your deck is pretty good at finding its healing options, if you're having to like 3 and 4 shot your opponent, I guess I question how much of an advantage are you really gaining at that point? And I think that's ultimately my biggest reservation for this card. There's plenty of support for this thing, but I think it's just going to come down to how frequently can your opponent play around this card, and will that damage output be high enough to compete with established decks like Mew VMAX and Giratina, as well as these new powerful Pokemon EX like Miraidon and Gardevoir as well. So I really do like this card. This is definitely going to be one of my pet decks of Scarlet and Violet. And if nothing else, I definitely think this is one of the more slept on EXs that we're going to be getting in this set. And for our final Pokemon of the Scarlet and Violet set review, we have Maushold. So this guy's definitely a little bit of a glass cannon, only clocking in at 70 HP here, but honestly, that's really not even that bad. That means this entire evolution line is going to be level ball searchable, and we can actually retrieve the entire line with Rescue Carrier as well. So definitely some pros to the sort of low amount of HP, though I definitely am skeptical of how you would ever beat a deck like Lost Box. But anyways, getting on to its actual attacks, the first one's nothing special, just 1 for 40. The second one, a lot more interesting, for 2 colorless energy to 70 for each of your Maushold in play. This is definitely an attack that makes me sad we are losing twin energy in the rotation. I mean, we do still have double turbo energy, but the 20 reduction is actually insanely relevant here, because if you do have 4 Maushold in play, you're going to be doing 280, which perfectly knocks out some of the best Pokemon V-Star, like Arceus, like Giratina, like Palkia. And now, because of double turbo energy, you are going to be forced to run copies of Choice Belt and or additional ways to power up a Maushold to get around that 20 reduction. Honestly, you probably do have to run some sort of extra energy acceleration either way, just because there aren't any other like double energies anymore. So you might have to play some copies of Raihan, or maybe even the new Armarouge. I definitely think that could be a workaround for some of these previously twin energy based decks that need a way at getting powered up. So maybe Magma Basin and Armarouge is going to be your secondary way of getting powered up, and who knows, maybe you can play things like Radiant Zard. But in terms of this deck's theoretical core strategy, we definitely have some issues. I think the biggest one is still just that you're going to need 4 Maushold in play at all times. And we already kind of talked about this a little bit with Spidops EX at the beginning of the set review, where if you have 4 of these in play and your opponent knocks out one, well, even if you can recover the evolution line, in this case with a card like Rescue Carrier, you still can't evolve up into Maushold in the same turn and keep that damage output maxed out. I think you're absolutely going to have to play a card like Zoroark in addition to your Mausholds here, which isn't even that bad. I do think that does open this deck up for some interesting backup attackers as well, with cards like Mighty Yenna to maybe help deal with the Mew VMAX matchup. They're going to be playing cards like Lost City already, which is going to just like body a deck like this. So having access to something like Mighty Yenna is actually kind of a plus. But there's still other things as well, like Slowbro from the Pokemon Go set you can maybe use as like a late game closer. So Zoroark, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It is going to eat into your consistency. You're not going to be able to fill up your bench with like as many consistency boosting Pokemon, but Zoroark definitely does give you access to a couple of important attackers that could sway your matchups from time to time. I mean, I definitely like this card. This card's certainly up my alley. It's a more traditional sort of setup-based evolution Pokemon. And I was really torn with what rating I wanted to dish out to this thing. But right now, I think I'm just leaning just slightly too negatively on this card for me to land in a more neutral spot on Mousehold. Because we lost Twin Energy, that means we have to fill our deck up with other clunky ways at cheating energies into play. Because we have to use double turbo energy means we have to play Choice Belt to do extra damage. Because we're playing Zoroark, we have fewer spaces on our field to commit to consistency boosting Pokemon. And also, I just think this deck is kind of badly positioned in the game right now too. So Mousehold's certainly a card I could change my tune on, especially as we get more cards added to the card pool to maybe fix some of this deck's shortcomings. But currently, at least, I just don't have quite enough faith in the card to stand beside it. Up next, we have a brand new supporter. This is going to be Arven. It says search your deck for an item card and a Pokemon tool card, reveal them and put them into your hand and shuffle your deck. Even though this does lack the digging power of something like a Professor's Research, the big upside to Arven, much like with cards like Skyla or Irida, is that you can kind of pick exactly what you might want here. And the limitation to just items and Pokemon tools really isn't even that bad because there's a number of items or Pokemon tools you can grab that actually allow you to search out other different cards. So let's say you need an energy in your deck. Well, you can grab an energy search. If you need a Pokemon, you can grab an Ultra Ball. But also because we have Forest Sealstone in the format, you could actually even grab that, which in turn gets you any card. Now, I will say right up front, I don't think this is the type of card that we'll see play in every deck, just because it is admittedly a little bit slower. I definitely think if this card does see any play, it's going to be in decks that already have some sort of non-supporter based draw engine. And I think one of the more obvious examples we could use for this is going to be something like Mew Max, because of course they have Genesect to be able to draw cards every turn. You're already playing Forest Sealstone, which you can grab with Arven. But there's a ton of other plays that this card could enable for Mew in particular. In the early game, this can act as a way at getting Battle VIP Pass, or even in the mid game, this can grab you something like a Choice Belt plus a Power Tablet to help ensure you can push to those sort of one-hit KO numbers out there. But in terms of non-Mew Max decks, admittedly, there's not a ton of them that come to mind. I think just as a general rule of thumb, we would look to pair this in decks that are playing other things like Babero or the new Revavroom, or again, some other way at drawing additional cards per turn, just because this effect is a little bit slow. Even if you are getting exactly what you want on the turn, well, you still can't grab anything to set up your next turn, which is where cards like Professor's Research do help. But overall, even though it is limited to only very specific types of engines, I like Arven. I would not be surprised if it's all play. Next up, we have a brand new, or somewhat new, I should say, stadium. That's going to be Beach Court. It says the retreat cost of each player's basic Pokemon is 1 colorless less. So the reason I say this is kind of a new card is because this is very similar to Sky Arrow Bridge back from the Black and White era, which actually was a card that did see some play. For better or for worse, Scarlet and Violet is not looking to give us something like an Air Balloon or a Floatstone reprint. So this is really our next best thing that decks have to make use of. This certainly wouldn't replace cards like Switch or Escape Rope in your deck, but definitely certain archetypes in particular could be looking seriously at this card, with probably the easiest one that comes to mind being Lost Box. And this effectively does give most of your Pokemon free retreat, at least like the core staples of most Lost Zone decks. Think of Comfey, Sableye, Cramorant, all these Pokemon have a 1 retreat cost. And this, I imagine, will be a key card at making sure you can keep switching between your different Comfeys. But I could also see this being good for Miraidon EX, since it also has a 1 retreat cost, and you can't attack with it on successive turns and you'll need to retreat. Also, if we do see the new Klefki popping up in decks, this could be a stadium to help ensure that players can get their Klefki into the active spot on turn 1 as well. However, some of the V-Star and V-Max decks out there with Pokemon that have a 2 or more retreat cost, I don't think are going to be looking at this. They would just rather play cards like Switch, since even with Beach Court in play, they would still have to burn energy to retreat. But again, as long as we have decks in the format that have Pokemon with a 1 retreat cost, and especially Pokemon with strong abilities in the active spot, like Comfey, like the Celebrations Mew, etc., Beach Court no doubt is going to be on the short list of stadiums to include in your deck. Next up, we have Defiant Band. It's a Pokemon tool card that says, if you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent, the attacks of the Pokemon this card is attached to do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. You guys are probably pretty familiar with effects like these. Of course, right now in the format, we have Choice Belt, which is no doubt the big card people are going to be drawing comparisons to. But it's also kind of similar to an older tool card called Solid Rage that did something very similar, which actually did see some play. But anyways, in terms of Defiant Band, I'm guessing this is the first of the comeback cards that Pokemon said that they were hoping to introduce in the Scarlet and Violet era of the game. So from the sounds of it, we might even get more cards kind of like this in the future. But in regards to this one specifically, I don't think this is going to see as much play as something like Choice Belt, but I definitely still think this is a pretty solid card that we have here. It's very fair, it's very balanced. Of course, the big trade-off compared to Choice Belt is that you do have to be behind on prizes, but the upside is that you can hit anything for 30 additional damage, not just Pokemon V. So that means even one prize Pokemon, though I don't know how often you actually need the extra damage against single prizers. But I think the big draw to this card over Choice Belt is that this actually will work on Pokemon EX, whereas Choice Belt will not hit them for any additional damage. I'm sure when Scarlet Violet first releases, Choice Belt still will see a ton of play, since a lot of the best attackers in the game still are Pokemon V. But I could definitely see as we get further and further into the Scarlet and Violet era, this definitely could be a card that pops up and starts seeing more and more play. But one of the things I really do like about this in particular is just that it rewards slower, more methodical, maybe setup based decks out there, and doesn't really do anything to help those big aggro decks like Mew V Max or like the Lost Box variants. And that's really what I like to see from card design. So whereas Choice Belt's going to be like a 2 to 3 of in a lot of decks, this card probably right out the gate, it's going to be like a 1 of, maybe a 2 of, depending on the deck. But even still, I think it's good enough to where some decks will be playing this right out the gate. But solid tool card, at the very least, is going to get better with time. Lightning Pokemon are going to love this next card. That is going to be Electricity Generator. New item card says look at the top 5 cards of your deck. You choose up to 2 basic Lightning Energy cards and attach them to your bench Lightning Pokemon in any way that you like, then shuffle the remaining cards into your deck. So players like myself who have been around for a little while now probably instantly recognize this effect being very similar to that of Max Elixir back from the XY era, which did something very similar. You got to look at the top 6 cards, but you only got 1 energy. So there is a bit of a trade-off between that card and this one. But Max Elixir, insanely popular card, very, very good, was basically played all the way up until it rotated. And I'm definitely expecting the same thing for Electricity Generator, assuming, of course, that we have decent Lightning Pokemon to pair with it. And right now, Miraidon EX is making a pretty good case for that. In theory, on turn 1, if you're going second, you can actually use this to get 2 energy on your Miraidon, attach an energy for turn, find a way to move it to the active spot, and then do an immediate 220. I think the big con to this card, of course, is that it's only look at the top 5 cards of our deck, and we are losing that Primate Wisdom Oranger, which means that it's going to be a little bit more difficult to always guarantee we hit energy. So that means we need to play cards like either Switching Cups, or just a higher basic energy count. Because if we are trying to play a deck that maybe forgoes using Flaffy and just these, if you ever miss energy with these, that seems pretty catastrophic. So it's going to be very important to build your decks in a way that ensures consistent hits with this card, which might end up making your deck a little less consistent since you do have to find more space for basic lightning energies. And then of course, we still do have Flaffy in the format, which does sort of overlap with this card in terms of its role in the format. Obviously, the big trade-off here is that this gives you much more explosive potential turn 1s or turn 2s. Flaffy's a little bit slower, it does limit your bench space, but I'd say your energy acceleration is a little bit more stable throughout the course of the game. But even still, I think these are relatively minor gripes overall. Even though this is 1 card less and is exclusive to Lightning Pokemon compared to Max Elixir, I don't think that's going to be enough to make this card not see play. Again, as long as we have decent Lightning attackers in the format, like the new Miraidon EX, this card absolutely is going to see play. Next up, we have another supporter card. That's going to be Jacques? I'm not really sure the pronunciation. Feel free to correct me down below in the comment section. But it says search your deck for up to 2 evolution Pokemon cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand and shuffle your deck. This is just a strict downgrade from the Arazu, another supporter card in the format I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation of. But that one gets you 3 cards at the cost of not being able to get Pokemon with a rule box. So I guess to be fair, that is kind of a big difference. And since we are losing Evolution Incense, I guess I can see why people would consider a card like this. But overall, this effect is just too slow, I think. I would rather just play Ultra Ball or even like Capturing Aroma probably over this. You know, maybe if I'm being generous, I could say that if you're playing this in a deck that has some sort of non-supporter based draw engine, like with things like Babarrel, Revavroom, or even Curlia. But even still, I think I'd rather just play other item-based forms of Pokemon Search. So I don't think the effect of this card is awful by any means, but I just think it's probably a little bit too slow for a supporter. For our next supporter card, we have Katie. This one says, using this card ends your turn. So that's bad. but you do get to shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 8 cards. So the question is this upside worth this massive downside? And honestly, I've got to say no. I think this card really isn't very good beyond turn 1, since on turn 2, 3, etc., you're trying to actually do damage at that point, not end your turn with this. And since you can no longer play supporters on the first turn of the game going first, this is limited to really just a very specific turn of certain games. Now, if I want to play devil's advocate here, I guess you could make the argument that there are certain decks that might try to play Katie, and those would be decks that are based around not actually ending their turn with an attack. So think of a card kind of like the Gormandized Snorlax that we're losing in the rotation, where you would end your turn by refilling your hand. So decks like that aren't based around attacking, or at least not for most of the game, definitely I think could look to this card. But other than that, this is going to be straight binder fodder. Next up, we have our final stadium of the set. That's going to be Mesa Goza. This one says, once during each player's turn, that player may flip a coin. If heads, they can search their deck for a Pokemon, reveal it, and put it into their hand and shuffle their deck. So if this effect sounds familiar, it should. This is just Pokeball. Like literally, this is Pokeball, but on a stadium card. And Pokeball really doesn't see any play. So you guys might be thinking, why is my rating what it is for this? Well, that's really for a few reasons here. Even though, yes, this does help your opponent too. They have access to this same effect. If this card remains in play for a couple turns, well, you can get repeated use out of this, whereas Pokeball, you play it and get tails. Well, that's kind of the end of that. Not only can you theoretically get repeated use out of this, but you can also use this just to bump other stadium cards. Pokeball can't bump something like Path to the Peak or Temple of Sinnoh, some of these annoying stadium cards you don't want your opponent to have in play, but this one can. And I never mind when we get these sort of decent, sort of generic stadiums that really any deck can probably make decent use of, because there's always going to be times where you're playing a deck that needs to have answers to certain stadiums in the format, and you're looking through the stadiums that we have just thinking, man, none of these really help my deck that much, which is where a card like this definitely could come in handy a bit. And with the Scarlet and Violet era looking to maybe push evolution Pokemon in stage 2s a little bit more, there might be more of a reason to want more Pokemon search in players' decks. Are there going to be games where you play this down, you flip tails, then your opponent uses it, flip heads, gets a Pokemon, then bumps it out of play with a stadium they would prefer? Yeah, that's going to happen, unfortunately. But I do think there is probably enough here to where very specific decks might want to take advantage of this card. If nothing else, I think this card probably will see more play than Pokeball, for whatever that's worth. Our next supporter card is going to be probably one of the more important ones we got in this set. That is going to be Miriam. It says, choose up to 5 Pokemon cards from your discard pile, reveal them, and shuffle them into your deck, then draw 3 cards. So I will say up front, I was kind of disappointed we didn't get something like an Ordinary Rod, Super Rod, Rescue Stretcher style reprint in this set, just because our recovery options are pretty weak. Some of the only options we're going to have are like Clara and Rescue Carrier, which both definitely have their own issues. But even though we're not getting an item-based form of recovery, which I do still really hope we get within a couple sets from now, I think this is a pretty good compromise. Definitely one of the better Pokemon recovery supporter cards that we've seen. So we have seen cards in the past like Brock's Grit or Flower Shop Lady, which actually have seen a little bit of play in certain decks for their times. But of course, the big issue with these sort of like Pokemon recovery supporters is that, well, yes, you can get all these Pokemon back into your deck, but because they are a supporter card, it's frequently very difficult to find the Pokemon you just put back and get it back into your hand and into play. So the fact that this has a draw 3 effect attached to it too, I think is really cool. I think that was a really smart design decision for this card. I definitely could see there being a little bit of a tug of war between this and Clara for space in certain decks, because I definitely think they both have their own pros and cons. Like Clara, of course, gets the Pokemon directly back into your hand. You can also get basic energies. But in the case of Miriam, the draw 3 actually could be good if you don't necessarily need the Pokemon right specifically in that moment. And of course, you can get up to 5 instead of the 2 that you get from Clara. So again, I think decks will definitely have to pick and choose which of these, if either of them, they might want to play in their decks. But if we're not getting an Ordinary Rod reprint or anything like that, I think Miriam is probably the best they could have done with the supporter. And I think it's probably just good enough to where it will see some play. Next up, we have debatably the biggest new trainer card, or semi-new trainer card that we're getting in the set. That is going to be Nestball. So Nestball is a reprint from the same card that we saw all the way in the Sun and Moon base set. And this one does the same exact thing. It says search your deck for a basic Pokemon and put it onto your bench and shuffle your deck. So of course, at this point, everyone knows we are losing Quick Ball in the new rotation. So the fact that we're getting Nestball to immediately slot into our decks after Quick Ball rotates is so great. Love to see this card. Now, it's definitely not as good as Quick Ball for kind of a number of reasons. I will say the big upside is that it does put Pokemon directly onto your bench, which is good in certain instances, like if your opponent has a Gapejaw Bog in play. This does get around those 2 damage counters, and you don't have to discard anything from your hand, which sometimes is a bonus, but I actually think both of these things are downsides more often than they're good. So many decks absolutely love the discard effect from Quick Ball, whether it's decks like Lugia or Mad Party that have wanted Pokemon in the discard pile, or decks that use cards like Flaffy and Melanie to accelerate energy out of the discard pile. And even though it's a small thing, Nest Ball also doesn't really allow you to thin cards from your deck. So like, let's say you're going to play a Professor's Research, you're going to discard your hand anyways. A lot of times players will use something like a Quick Ball to find maybe an extra Pokemon they don't need in that matchup and toss it away with Research, taking it out of the deck to draw into better cards. Well, Nest Ball really doesn't allow those sorts of plays to happen, unfortunately. But probably the bigger downside to Pokemon going straight to your bench is that unlike something like Quick Ball, we actually can't make use of powerful coming into play abilities with cards like Lumineon V, which is honestly kind of big. But that being said, the card is still great. This is still going to be probably by far the card from Scarlet and Violet that sees the most play in every deck. Yes, it's not Quick Ball, but I'm still happy to have this one back. Next up, we have Penny, which is another new supporter card, and this one says return one of your basic Pokemon in play and all cards attached to it to your hand. So we are no strangers to effects like this throughout the Pokemon TCG. I mean, right now we have Sharon's Care, which has actually seen play even though it's limited to just colorless Pokemon. But we have seen a couple of other cards with a very similar effect see a ton of play, most notably being AZ and Acerola. All of these like scoop up style supporters have all had their own downsides, but it hasn't stopped any of them from being good. And Penny definitely could be in that same camp. Now, I will say the limitation to just basic Pokemon does kind of go against the main use we've seen from cards like this. Like even looking at Sharon's Care, one of the big uses we've seen for it is a way at healing your Pokemon. But the fact that this is just for basic Pokemon means that inherently the Pokemon that we can use this with are going to have less HP and are on average going to have fewer options to tank. So I think if we are going to play Penny, it's probably going to be either with some of the tankier Pokemon V in the format, like Blissey V as an example, but it still does have some uses outside of like tanking and healing strategies. So of course we are losing Scoop Up Net in the rotation, which is definitely a huge blow to Lost Box, since we can no longer just keep picking up comfies and reusing the same ones over and over. Now, don't get it confused. Penny is no replacement for Scoop Up Net. Absolutely not. Being a supporter means this is very slow by comparison, but could Lost Box decks still play this as maybe like a one of? I definitely think that's worth considering. And we could even see players use this as kind of a denial card, kind of like Volo, by removing like low HP bench sitter multi-prizers like Lumineon from play. But like I said, guys, all of these scoop up style supporters have been pretty great at some point. So I'd be very surprised if Penny did not follow suit. But to what extent this will be played, we just don't really know that quite yet. Next up, we have a new item card. That's going to be Picnic Basket. And this one says heal 30 damage from all Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent. So very important distinction to make there. But honestly, guys, I think this card is kind of deceptively good. I think a lot of people might look at this and think, I really don't want to heal my opponent's Pokemon, which I totally understand. But really think about it. Think about the decks that you find yourself playing. A lot of decks right now are taking one-hit KOs. So if that's the case, you don't really care if you're healing your opponent since you're just knocking them out anyways. And a lot of decks that are going for 2-hit KOs, they do so much damage that a heal 30, sometimes even healing a 60 or 90 with multiple of these, isn't actually even going to change the math to push you into a 3-hit KO. And at that point, this is just a strictly better version of Potion since you're healing from all of your Pokemon. I guess at that point, we just have to think, well, okay, then what deck actually might want to play this? I think the big one that comes to mind for me immediately is going to be Blissey V. We've seen Blissey play a ton of like quote unquote bad sort of healing cards throughout its time in Standard. So this thing definitely could sort of carry that tradition a little bit. Especially since we're losing Hyper Potion and Team Yeltao, this is really one of the few next best things we could consider playing. But there is also another combo I will mention. Of course, we did look at the Slowbro earlier in the set review. I think this card really naturally pairs well with that, because if you can get a couple of different Slowbro in play, you can actually move all of the damage from your active to your various Slowbros that you have, then spam these Picnic Baskets to heal off all of that damage. And also if a deck like Lost Box, which just kind of pokes at your opponent little by little, still remains popular, a card like this actually could be kind of annoying for them to maybe throw off some of that spread damage math that they are setting up throughout the course of a game. I think it's definitely sort of a niche card. This is not going to be like a new staple like something like Ultra Ball or Quick Ball, but I actually don't think people should be sleeping on this. I think this card is actually a little bit better than some people might be giving it credit for. Next up, we have Rock Chestplate. This is a new Pokemon tool card that says the fighting Pokemon this card is attached to takes 30 less damage from attacks from your opponent's Pokemon. So I guess we have this to pair with our Miraidon EX. I assume that's what they're going for here. And yeah, a 30 reduction is pretty good. But I am a little bit curious if it actually makes a difference, at least for the fighting Pokemon that have the most promise for the new format. I'm thinking of cards, again, like Miraidon, like the Great Tusk, maybe even like Lucario V-Star or Lucario EX. Like, I guess we could play this with those cards, but they're still weak to Psychic, which means Mew is going to body them either way. But I'm curious, even outside of Mew, is this actually going to change a one-shot to a two-shot? That's what gives me some pause about this card. I could definitely see this being good against something like Lost Box, where they're just kind of chipping away at you throughout the course of a game. A 30 reduction is actually pretty good over the course of multiple attacks. But against some of the chunkier hitting multi-prize Pokemon in the format, I just don't know if this is actually going to make a bit of a difference. And that's also partially due to the format still being kind of an unknown. At the end of the day, if this 30 reduction does change a one-shot to a two-shot, yeah, it's going to see play. Otherwise, it's probably not going to do much. And for the final card of our set review, we have Team Star Grunt. New supporter card that says put an energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon on top of their deck. So this is kind of similar to the Team Yell Grunt, and actually, to be honest, I thought this was like the same exact effect until I went and checked on that card, but it is actually a little bit different. Team Yell Grunt put the energy into their hand, so putting on top of deck is actually kind of an upgrade there. But Team Yell Grunt lets you remove the energy from any of their Pokemon, whereas this is limited to just the active. Now, that being said, the card definitely still could see play. Look back at Team Yell Grunt. It saw play even though it didn't discard energy, it only put the card back into your opponent's hand. But really, as long as the removal of the energy can deny your opponent's attack next turn, or really just put them a turn behind in some way, that's enough to allow a card like this to still see some play. So I imagine Sander Watchkick and all of the control players out there will probably be eyeing this card down. You know, for the vast majority of decks, this card's not going to get too much attention, kind of like in the case of Team Yell Grunt, mainly because it's a supporter, guys. This is going to be a very slow effect. Most decks rather just be playing a draw supporter like a Professor's Research. And since most decks aren't built around removing energy and preventing your opponent from attacking, for your average prize-taking aggro deck out there, this isn't going to do a whole lot for them. But for those annoying energy-denying control style decks, which inevitably will pop up from time to time, this is going to be a card that I think they're going to be looking at. So that's going to be our look at Scarlet and Violet. And I've got to say, I think even for a base set, which typically wind up being a little bit more underwhelming than some of the future sets, I think Scarlet and Violet is actually overall really solid. I think there is a lot to like here. Most notably, of course, the reintroduction of Pokemon EX. But even zooming out and looking at all of the Pokemon of the set, I think overall we have a pretty healthy mix of good evolutions and good basic Pokemon. And I think we also got a pretty solid batch of trainer cards that do a solid enough job at replacing some of the cards we're losing in the rotation. But even still, I do have a couple of gripes with this set overall. Even though the best new Pokemon in this set are, I think, pretty above average, they're still kind of modest when we compare them to other cards like Mew V Max or Lugia V-Star, where the entire format sort of warps around them. Don't get it misconstrued, I'm definitely happy about that for the health of the game, but like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I think the power level for this set is just a little lower than I think some might have expected. But overall, I'm going to land on a 4 out of 5 for Scarlet and Violet here. I'm kind of rating this set a little bit on a curve just because, again, usually these base sets of a new block are a little bit mid. They usually play it very safe. And kind of within that context, I think Scarlet and Violet is actually better than most of the ones we've seen. But of course, guys, I'm sure a lot of your thoughts are going to differ from mine, especially since we looked at a ton of cards today. So be sure to sound off down below in the comment section what you think about Scarlet and Violet. How would your final score differ from mine? What were your favorite cards that we looked at? I'll be looking forward to hearing your thoughts down below. But if you guys did enjoy today's content, as always, remember to leave a like on the video. And if you're feeling maybe a little bit extra generous and want to take that support to the next level, you can also become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch over at rarecandytcg.com. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.